What would you do if you heard footsteps on the upper floor, but you knew no one was supposed to be there? Or if you saw a pale face staring at you in the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere? In today's video, we're sharing some spine-chilling stories that will have you questioning what could be lurking in the dark. So grab a cup of tea, get comfy, and prepare for horror that will stay with you long after this video ends. And if you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It starts on one side of the room, casually walks to the other, and stops. This happens maybe twice a night. I didn't start hearing it until I was about 14, when my grandparents made me start sleeping in a different room on the first floor. Anyway, I have always been afraid of the upstairs at their house. I don't know why, but it's always freaked me out, and I refuse to ever go up there alone. I'm 23 now, and I still won't go up alone. There's one room specifically, though. It's a long, narrow bedroom. When you open the door, there are closets on your left and right, a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a window on the far side opposite the door. Growing up, I was told by my grandparents that the sons of the previous owner claimed to see a gorilla come out of the closet at night, dance around the room, and go back into the closet. I thought nothing of this story until I had to start sleeping in the other room, the room located directly below the scary room upstairs. So we all go to bed. All the lights in the house are off, and I'm still awake. Then I heard it, starting at one end of the room upstairs. It got closer to me, passed right above me, and continued to the end of the room where it stopped. I was wide awake, terrified out of my mind. It was no question to me that I had heard footsteps. I knew that slow, casual pace. I was freaked out and went to my grandpa's room. I told him what I heard, and he told me that the house is old and it creaks. But he turned the dining room light on for me, so I felt a little safer. I tried going back to sleep. Then it started again, this time from where it ended the first time, by the window upstairs. It walked over me again and stopped when it reached the door. I thought it was over until 5 seconds later when I heard it coming down the stairs. Silence as it reached the landing. And silence again as it reached the first floor. I was frozen in shock. Whatever it was on my floor of the house, and sadly unaffected by the dining room light. I was staring at the doorway to my room. The dining room light was shining in, and my vision began to distort. I felt dizzy with fear, so I pulled the blankets over my head and suddenly heard a scratching sound from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from too, my grandpa's gun case. It was a very obvious sound, scratching on the wood. Long scratches down the front of the gun case. I could even hear the door ever so slightly tapping against the frame as each scratch began. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I took a second to take a deep breath and let out a loud scream. In seconds, my grandpa had made it to my room, and I was relieved. Needless to say, he still didn't believe me. So I did what any normal person would do. I draped a sheet over the side of the bed and slept underneath it. I wrapped myself tight in a comforter, put on headphones, and turned my back to the door. There could be a party of ghosts in my room, and I wouldn't even know. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma about what happened the night before, but she just brushed it off. Needless to say, I slept under the bed for the rest of my week-long stay with them. I've stayed there countless times since that happened, and I hear the footsteps every time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but keep my back to the door and sleep with headphones on. I haven't heard it come down the stairs since that first night, but if it does, I don't want to know. While I was deployed in Kosovo, my team did a lot of night missions that required us to cover a great deal of ground in a short period of time to make our extractions, all while remaining undetected by anyone in the areas we passed through. We would always seem to see odd things during the night, but nothing like this. During one of our recon missions, we were dropped off in a remote location to identify whether shipments of mortar rounds and mines were being moved through the area. Our extraction was going to be before daybreak, and we needed to cover just over 10 miles. The terrain wasn't too overgrown, and we had good intel about the area. It was either a full moon or close to it, so unless we encountered somebody, it was going to be an easy night. Our team was normally only 4 men, but we took the opportunity to make this a good training run for some of the new guys, so we added an extra 3. We still wanted to play it safe, though, so I took rear security and, we'll call him Mark, took the position just in front of me. We worked great together and could easily manage to cover our team if needed. We moved about 7 miles through our mission area without finding anything and had made good time doing it. At this point, we needed to start heading for our extraction point, which was located over a good-sized hill and then through an area near a village, but not too close. We regrouped, did a count of people, ammo, and supplies, and moved out. Being rear security, I was the last to move. Just as I was about to take off, I heard a noise in the trees, maybe 50 yards off. I turned and saw Mark looking in the same direction. He had heard it too. Everyone else was still moving, since the new guys in the middle weren't used to looking back every 20 yards to spot security. We were getting left behind. Chances were the noise was nothing more than a deer, but Mark and I started moving out, using a 2-man bounding technique. We kept hearing a noise, so I told Mark to reach the team while I remained in place after our next bound. I found a spot with cover, and he bolted after the team. I heard the noise again and saw the trees move about 15 yards in front of me. Everything stopped. 2 minutes went by, with me being very quiet, controlling my breathing, and watching my front and sides. Mark and my team were slowly making their way to engage whatever had been following us. They came up on the sides and surrounded the area I signaled to. Once in position, I moved up. Nothing. No footprints, tracks, or any sign that something had been there. Cue the guys giving Mark and me a hard time for getting left behind and scared. Good-hearted fun, of course. We moved out again. Again, I was the last to move, with Mark between me and the next man in front. This time, no noises when I stepped away. After about 2 miles, we came up to an orchard we needed to move through. The moonlight was really bright, and the trees were spaced out, so we used them for cover as we stayed near the middle of the orchard. Just before I entered, I heard the noise again. This time, I thought I heard a little girl giggling. Not something my imagination would make up on its own. I was expecting wildlife, if anything. This time, Mark had taken off an additional 20 yards and turned to wait for me. I moved to my location, and he moved out again. I crouched next to a tree, watching for anything. All of a sudden, the tree next to me caught my attention. In the knots on the tree, I could see a face that looked like a person. As I squinted and looked more closely, a little girl's face appeared. She turned to me, smiling, waved a little hand, and giggled, not maliciously, then disappeared back into the tree. I was in absolute shock at this point, and there was no chance in hell I was going back to my team to report what I had just seen. So instead, I bolted to catch up to Mark and kept my mouth shut. Recognizing that I had likely lost my mind, I wasn't going to talk about it. We hid our extract and left. 2 weeks went by, and I was told I was needed to provide security for a team of combat engineers going through an area I was familiar with. In the meantime, my team would be going through the area where Mark and I had gotten scared 2 weeks ago, everyone laughing. Again, I hadn't said a word to anyone about what I saw. In my mind, I was quite happy not to be going back there. So, I went out with the engineers and helped them find a minefield that had been recently laid in an area that kids walk through every day, and they took care of informing the nearby village while starting to blow the mines in place. I really appreciated the engineers and the work they did out there. I got back and was taken to see my commander and thanked for the work. Feeling great, I headed back to my barracks room, a place I rarely got to visit, and saw that none of the guys were back yet. No sooner had I taken my boots off than the door opened, and I heard everyone laughing as they entered. Mark wasn't laughing, though, and was telling everyone to screw themselves. One of the other guys saw me and blurted out, "Mark says he isn't going on patrol with us anymore in your favorite spot." I just grimaced and waited for stuff to calm down. A couple of days later, Mark and I were out playing babysitter to some scouts. He asked me what did I see that night, but I just shrugged and said, I don't know. Just my imagination getting the better of me. Then he said something that sent chills up my spine. He said he saw her too. I felt numb and just asked, where did you see her? He said, inside a tree. I had never given any information to Mark about what I saw or any details that could have led him to come up with the same conclusion. When I saw the girl in the tree, Mark was 40 yards away from my location and couldn't have even seen me looking at the tree. When I was about 13 or 14, I lived on a farm in North Carolina. This wasn't a regular farm with fields full of beans and such. It was actually a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, so we basically lived in the woods and would bale pine straw every year. Anyway, the point is that my house was in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined longleaf pines. My living room had a huge picture window. I won't go into the architecture of the house, but it was a weird custom job built by some dentist in the 30s. The window stretched nearly the entire length of the living room, maybe 50 feet. The house was built on a subtle hill, so the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground, giving you a view of a solid mile of pine trees. During the winter, it was unsettling because you'd get just a bit of snow, enough to reflect moonlight, so that you could see the dogs running around at night. I'll be honest, I hated that room and that window. Now, to the relevant part. I had a cousin over for the weekend, and we were doing what kids do in the country, throwing stuff in the fireplace to see what would happen. It was getting late, and the fire was dying down, so we built the big kingdom of couch cushions and blankets in the living room and got ready for bed. Nothing out of the ordinary until we heard the dogs barking. They were really far away. The property stretched for nearly a mile, so I just assumed they were chasing off whatever animal felt like messing around in our yard. My cousin was staring out the window and not saying anything, which prompted the standard "what's up?" He just kept staring and said he felt like he was seeing things. Naturally, I got all anxious and started staring out the window as well. Nothing happened for a few minutes, and he got more and more annoyed with me because I kept asking what he saw. He kept shushing me so he could focus. Then we both saw it. A shadow of a person moving from one tree to the next. Not a run, not a leap, just a brisk walk from one tree to another. This was probably 100 yards from the house. We couldn't actually tell if the person was coming closer or not because we were dealing with moonlight reflecting off snow, slush, and ice. The crazy part is we didn't freak out. At this point, there was still a chance we didn't actually see what we thought we saw, you know? So we just kept staring. We should have gone to wake up my dad, but he's the kind of guy who would walk out onto the patio and holler into the woods with his rifle. We were just scared enough to agree that we didn't want to taunt whatever was happening. About 3 minutes later, it happened again, but about 50 feet from where we first saw it. Another person, another tree, a few strides, and they were gone. This kept happening every few minutes for the next half hour, and we just stared. At this point, I should mention that I didn't really have neighbors. The land surrounding our farm was owned by federal paper. I don't know who owns it now, so it was miles and miles of uncultivated trees. You don't see people around the farm unless they intend to be there. We kept watching as these two figures intermittently appeared and vanished, until finally we saw one appear. But this time it didn't disappear. Instead, we focused in on it and saw that it was now running toward the house. We lost it and went to wake up my dad. By the time we got back with my half-awake father, there was no one to be seen. We sprinted around, locking doors and windows. Keep in mind, we were out in the country with no one around, so it rarely occurred to us to lock doors. Every door we locked felt worse than the last because you just knew that as soon as you reached it, someone was going to be trying to open it, though that never happened. We locked everything up and walked around the house at least 50 times, making sure no one had gotten in without us knowing. We convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us while we stared out the window. I never understood why my dad wouldn't call of the police. He always had this we take care of our own mentality. The next day, we went out to look, and sure enough, there were footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between trees, and then we finally saw where someone had been standing right in front of the window. But as I said, I wouldn't have seen them because while I was 7 feet up in the living room, they would have been standing right beneath me. When I was in high school, I had a really good friend who lived next door to a house that was always up for sale. People would move out in the middle of the night without a word, and it hadn't had the same owner for more than 6 months straight for a couple of years. One night, we were really bored and he suggested we go explore the house next door since it had sat empty for a while. We go around back and there's a dog door that he can crawl through. He unlocks the door and lets me in. The house itself is really unremarkable. It looked like it was built maybe in the 1950s and was a craftsman-style house in an older, nicer part of town. My friend's house was similarly built. The kitchen had a really nice built-in breakfast table set against a picture window. The house's electricity was off, but you could see the streetlight through the window. My friend and I sit down on the floor, across from this table, and are just hanging out, talking. Why? Who knows? All of a sudden, my friend screams, and in that instant, my vision goes black. But it wasn't that I just couldn't see. My body was engulfed in this sickly coldness from head to toe. I start screaming, and I feel my friend's hand grabbing mine and pulling me in some direction forcefully. My vision slowly comes back, and I start to warm up when I realize that we're outside under the streetlight. It was December and should have been much warmer inside that house. Finally, I look at my friend, and he looks scared. I'm really confused and kind of panicked myself, and finally ask him what happened. He says that as I was talking, a black thing, this figure that was all black, and only had the vague shape of a girl, crawled out from under the table and sat on top of me. Apparently, I started groping around with my eyes wide open, like I couldn't see, and he was so freaked out he pulled me out of the house. We're still friends, and we bring it up every now and then, but the story itself never changes, and it still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I've never felt such blackness or coldness in my life. It was palpable, almost sticky. For a couple of days afterward, I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling, and I could never walk past that house again. Thank you for staying until the end, and I really hope you enjoyed. Have you ever experienced something that felt just a little too eerie to explain? Share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Stay curious and stay safe.